Hey everyone, Mike the Warrior here. A while ago, I did a video talking about Dan's rivals. So finally, I have to talk about the rivals of Drago. Like last time, we're going in order of appearance, and I'm going to be ranking them on how I feel. We went off of certain criteria, and I'm going to basically be doing the same thing, but we will have to change some details. Things like how much did they challenge Drago, what was their role in the story, etc., etc. So without further ado, let's get started. Reaper is the first ace of Masquerade, and he has a lot of fans. And I understand why. He looks cool. Him and Masquerade together were the original duo who worked together to send Bakugan to the Doom Dimension, more or less Bakugan Hell, and that is one of the main reasons on what makes Reaper cool. He's a Grim Reaper. The aesthetic matches completely. Some could argue it's pretty on the nose, but that's basically what it comes down to with this guy. Now, there is no literal connection to him in the Doom Dimension, but that, again, is the aesthetic that they went with. And Reaper has something that no one else on this list has, and that is the fact that in the beginning of Battle Brawlers, we had a lot of villains of the week, and a lot of those villains of the week worked for Masquerade. So if they were a Darkest Bakugan, there was a chance that Masquerade lended his Reaper to whoever this random schmuck was. So we got to see Reaper a lot more even when Masquerade wasn't always battling. And this is a blessing and a curse. We got to see more of Reaper and his early rivalry with Drago, but unfortunately it came to a very swift end because of one major factor. It's not just the Bakugan, it's the partner. Not every random Bob or Timmy from down the street is going to be like Masquerade. So while Reaper did beat Dan one time when he didn't have Drago, he did end up losing quite a bit, and he's probably not even as intimidating as when we first saw him. And I think the writers knew this because Reaper ends up getting replaced. And I mean in a more literal sense than anyone else here. The shiny new toy being Darkest Hydronoid, and when Hydronoid makes his debut, not only is he straight up claiming that he's the strongest Bakugan ever, he also feeds the Bakugan he sends to the Doom Dimension, and Reaper doesn't even look like he's going to check this dude when he talks about being the strongest. And then, because Masquerade activated the third Judgment Gate card, only one Bakugan is allowed to remain on said gate card. So even though they work together to try to jump Dan, Hydronoid stabs Reaper in the back with his tail and sends him to the Doom Dimension. By the way, if you grew up in America or, somewhere not Japan, there's a really high chance that was censored. So he just swings his tail and then we just get a really awkward cut. But anyway, because Reaper honestly gets hoed, it does knock down his points quite a bit. But I think it would have been fine, justice for all those Bakugan he sent to the Doom Dimension and whatnot. But then, for some reason, they show Reaper in the Doom Dimension after Drago finally loses to Hydronoid and gets sent there himself. We see a bunch of Bakugan turned to stone and the looming implication that this is the fate that awaits Drago if he can't leave. Reaper even shows up to taunt Drago, then leaves, and that's about it. A lot of the Bakugan that were sent to the Doom Dimension, a lot of named Bakugan, get at least one more appearance, but he is right up there with Angelo and Diablo of Bakugan that were just kind of forgotten, which is a shame. I don't have a huge attachment to Reaper, but I do always think that it was kind of weird about how they got rid of this guy. If it wasn't for that extra scene, then I think I'd be a bit more fine with where they ended his character, but because they did what they did, this is going to be how I end it. So I'm probably going to put Reaper somewhere around here. He's a good first start. Now we have the big boy. I was making jokes earlier about how Masquerade, got his new toy that he used to replace Reaper, and that was Hydronoid. He was introduced as the strongest Bakugan ever. Yes, it was self-proclaimed, but it's pretty easy to understand why you would think that. No one had G power as high as Hydronoid at the time. It's hilarious that at the time this was considered the highest number, but still, Dan and Shun only were able to beat him because they had to use an anime-like weakness, aim for his mouth while he's charging up, because he was just too powerful. And then he was the second Bakugan to evolve after Drago, where Masquerade proceeded to go through the gauntlet and go after the previous people who worked with him, the rest of the top 10 strongest, or, well, they were still in that category. They just weren't in like the top 5 anymore. And Hydronoid just bodied them over and over and over again until he evolves into Dual Hydronoid. And it's a very, very nice design. You know, Hydronoid, Hydra, based off of the Greek, monster, makes sense, right? And also, from an aesthetic purpose, we had Reaper being a Grim Reaper, while Hydronoid is pretty simple. Dragon versus dragon. It makes sense. And honestly, watching dragons fight each other is just really, really cool. But basically, Hydronoid has the, I guess, clout or so, the feat of seeming like this immovable object. No matter what you did, it seemed like Drago and Dan just couldn't beat this guy. They even blew off one of his heads, and that didn't even work. He just grew back another one, and that round didn't even count anymore. Because that's actually an ability that Hydronoid has. If for whatever reason you try to blow off his head, he can just cancel the battle and then grow a new one. You don't even need an ability for that. And that's just dual and regular Hydronoid. I'd even get to Alpha Hydronoid. Hydronoid's reputation goes even above Battle Brawlers. Nuvastroya gasses him up as well to some extent by making Hades, because it felt like they knew how popular Hydronoid was. Maybe the toy makers or just the writers knew that they had to have some representation of Hydronoid, so that's why we got Hades. And it doesn't stop there. After Nuvastroya, while Hydronoid technically doesn't come back in a meaningful way, once we get to the reboot, Hydronoid's in the reboot as well. It's Aqua's Infinity Hydronoid instead, but still, yes, obviously he isn't Drago, and eventually the creators of the show and the creators of the game wanted to do something with other Bakugan, but Hydronoid's reputation just speaks for itself when you look at him. So when you have that final battle with Masquerade, it feels like it's the end of a saga. That, okay, they did it. They beat Masquerade. Dan beat Masquerade. Drago beat Hydronoid, finally, after all this time. And while Masquerade left after finally teaming up with Dan, Hydronoid did stay for a bit. And in his own way, different from another character, he does acknowledge that Drago is the better fighter. As a rival, as said previously, before Drago could even begin his journey where he basically was getting new MacGuffins and becoming God every season, he had to overcome this insane obstacle that was Hydronoid. And for that, I will have Hydronoid at the top of S for now. There is a strong chance that this might change. We'll see what happens when we get there. For the sake of argument and trying to extend the list, I'm going to have a cheat code here, and I'm going to put Naga. Naga does have quite a bit of screen time, but his relationship and rivalry, if we're stretching the term, with Drago is a bit more personal than Hydronoid in terms of story. He is the main villain of the first season of Bakugan, yes, but Naga was a member of the White Ones, the Bakugan without attribute. I've never liked that name, but I'm not really gonna stay too long on it. Anyway, Naga and Drago's relationship is basically, hey, this is my friend, he's dating my sister. But Naga only had Wyvern and Drago, and he wasn't really okay with that. He had nothing. So when he tried to make something of himself by taking the silent core, he got power hungry and it corrupted him. Or maybe this was always who he really was, and Drago was there trying to stop him, but he didn't listen. So after this, he doesn't really care for Drago. The only thing he wants is the Infinity Core, and Wyvern has that. But the thing that always gets me is when he's attacking Wyvern, Drago calls out to him and he basically just backhands the guy. It's like, this doesn't concern you. But as soon as Drago gets the Infinity Core, his whole attitude changed. And I think it's kind of sad in a way. This was his friend once upon a time, but Wyvern had to die because of Naga, and Drago doesn't have that attachment to the dude anymore. You mean nothing to me, basically, is what has become of these two former friends. Now, in terms of battle, these two were quite literally the strongest Bakugan because they had basically the things that kept their universes intact and they were fighting over them. And yes, the battle is pretty insane, but if we're being honest, I think personally, I haven't actually checked, I don't think there's a huge group of people who are campaigning for Naga like that. As a character, outside of the stuff I said, there's not a crazy whole lot. He is a mustache twirly villain at the end of the day, but I think it was fine for what the series was trying to do. This ultimate evil that everyone had to band together to basically beat. And if we're being honest, there are going to be some other characters on this list that will be mustache twirly villains. But for the sake of argument, I will have maybe Naga at B, possibly A. We'll see how it looks once I put everyone else on the list. Now we have the fan favorite, Helios, based off of the Greek sun god. By the time we get to New Vestroia, Drago really only has one rival, and it's Helios. Another dragon v dragon rivalry, and it's more or less like that for the remainder of the series. More or less, but we'll get there when we get there. The important thing is Helios wanted to be the strongest Bakugan. That's basically his whole thing. He is very different from Hydronoid in a pretty unique way. While Hydronoid was this unbeatable obstacle, Helios was trying to be that. We are kind of seeing it from an alternate perspective. The story keeps trying to tell us that Helios is this unstoppable behemoth, and to some extent that's true. That all changes when he fights Drago. He's always second best to Drago. And from Helios's perspective, no one could touch him till Drago, basically the god of this new world that he's been brought back to or been born in. It hasn't really been touched on, if I'm being honest. But Drago basically was a deity, and he created New Vestroia. He gave it up, all that power, for his friends and his people. And then he got reborn into this weak body that Helios just can't really comprehend. Why would he do that? So naturally they fight because originally he wants to understand Drago. Why would he do that? And he's disappointed fairly quickly. Helios loses that match, but he has two excuses. One, well, Spectra wanted to study Drago at the time. Two, more importantly, the idea that he could only beat him because of the perfect core. Once we get a level playing field with the forbidden abilities, he is able to beat Drago, but that is the only time he's actually able to beat Drago. Once Spectra gets a hold of Drago and Dan wins him back, Helios just has to accept the fact that he needs more power if he's going to need to beat Drago, because, well, he wants to be the strongest no matter what. So Helios goes about trying to be the strongest in his own way. He starts desecrating his body, more or less, by letting Spectra experiment on him. He becomes a cyborg monstrosity of a thing, and that's how we get Cyborg Helios Mark 1 and Mark 2. And no matter how many upgrades, he never actually definitively beats Drago. Even when he has the Farba system, Drago's able to overpower it with sheer might of the Infinity Core. And when he gets Maxis Helios, Drago's able to do the same thing. He can't beat this guy. And then when it's all at the very end of their rivalry, he has Battle Gear. And at that point, he was stronger than Drago, finally. But Drago evolved before they could get their final matchup. And when that final matchup happened, the Battle Gear didn't really matter at the end of the day. And in that final clash, Helios finally was able to understand why Drago was able to be as strong as he was. He's never truly fighting for himself. He's always fighting for others. Always fighting to protect others. And what I really like is the detail of in that clash, or maybe you could say that's the point, but my Helios looks at Spectra and protects Spectra. And he finally understands what makes Drago so strong, and that wraps up their rivalry. From Drago's perspective, Helios, well, he kept having to fight this guy to basically try to prove that he's not the best. Like, Drago basically had to constantly keep putting him in his place. And I do think he did truly hate the guy, but he just kind of had a soft respect for him at one point. Especially because Helios was consistently putting their differences aside towards the end of the attribute energy arc because he wanted to be the one to beat Drago. But it's stubbornness to the point where at least he's able to see the bigger picture. Like, he didn't condemn his home just so he could fight Drago. And yeah, like I said earlier before I started this whole thing, Helios, what makes him different from Hydronoid is he's not this, at least wasn't originally part of this unstoppable force that he just couldn't beat. This time it's the opposite. And I actually think that uniqueness makes him stand out a lot more because then, even though I'm not crazy about this, but I'll save my ranting for another time, he comes back in Titanium Surge and he's Darkest Helios this time around. And him and Drago's relationship has improved and it's consistent. He even starts glazing how powerful the two of them are going to be once they use the Bakugan fusion thing. He in the dub he even calls Drago my friend, and it's nice development for him. So Helios is also going in S. Rubinoid isn't a real rival, but if we're counting him, again, I have an excuse to make the list longer, because I don't really think Lionholt necessarily counts. He easily could have, but I'm going to put Rubinoid on here anyway, because Sid was sort of a rival for Dan. Rubinoid was the Bakugan of Sid. They didn't have a real lasting impact on Drago. He was just the Bakugan he fought the most in that first little arc of Gundalian Invaders. He did beat Drago. He had a lot of help to do that, but he did beat Drago. A Drago that was stronger than Helios. So take that however you will. But if I'm being honest, again, to fill up the list, this is kind of why he's here. Rubinoid is probably going at C. So we talked about having this unstoppable force in Hydronoid and the obsessive rivalry with Helios. So what if the two of them did a fusion dance? And what would we get? You get Darak. Darak is honestly what made the other two work, even though it didn't have nearly as much screen time. It's not all perfect 10 out of 10, but we'll get there. In Gundalian Invaders, the Gundalians' Emperor Barodius has a Bakugan named Darak. And in Gundalia, he is top dog. He cannot be touched by anyone. He fights a war and basically can win it single-handedly with just his battle gear. And when you see him use it, I think it's Air Core Zan, like, you understand just through that visual alone, yeah, this guy's kind of overpowered. We get a feeling that outside of, first impressions, there is something up with this guy because him and Drago have this weird connection. But then when Drago evolves from Luminum Dragonoid, by the way, he is the first person to actually beat Drago in that form. Drago then evolves into Blitz Dragonoid, and he fights Darak again. And then Drago still almost loses. In his new debut form, he almost loses because Darak is just too overpowered. And the reason for all of this is because it turns out the two of them are descendants of the original Bakugan, Genesis Dragonoid and Daraknoid. And because of that, they are somewhat destined to fight. More importantly, they are the natural counters to each other. That is technically the explanation on why can he keep up with Drago's newly evolved form. It's like in Pokemon, when Dragon and Dragon fight, they just counter each other. They're both super effective. Anyway, when he loses to Blitz Dragonoid, he has to take some of Drago's DNA to basically enhance himself so he can become Phantom Darak. And we see a completely different side of this guy as soon as he acquires this ability. He is in his lab basically wanting to tear down the walls so he can get to Drago's prison cell and fight him because he wants a rematch. He wants to prove he's better because Darak hasn't lost before. He needs to prove he's the better Bakugan. And honestly, that right there is one of the biggest things for me because it gets an interesting bit of characterization for Darak because at the time he was a pretty calm and collected guy. Like when it was time to battle, he would wild out, but never like that before. And speaking of his obsession with Drago, the reason why in comparison to Helios, he has it in spades, I'm down, well, I'm paraphrasing here, but his hatred for Drago was so great, he refused to die. The Silent Orb, I believe it was called. No, the Sacred Orb basically killed him because after he loses to Drago for the final time, he tries to get the power for himself anyway. And the Sacred Orb basically just annihilates him and Barodius on the spot, but that didn't kill them because then they come back immediately in Mactanium Surge. They basically, again, still paraphrasing, get reborn as Magmel and Ravenoid, who I am counting as one character for now, but give me a second. And their pent up anger and hatred, they get a whole new list of powers, new, like, corrupted forms of. I keep calling him Ravenoid, but it's Ravenoid, whatever. And yeah, all of this happens because at this point they just want to kill Dan and Drago. Like that's just what it comes down to. They want to kill Dan and Drago. And by playing stuff behind the scenes, they almost break up the battle brawlers. He even fights Helios after he turns into this mutated like version of his already corrupted form after taking some plot stuff from Dan and Drago. And that final battle, even though I have issues with Mactanium Surge, that final battle between Ravenoid slash Darak and Drago is insane. I think it's one of the best battles in the show. So because of that, if I'm counting them both as the same character, Darak is also an S. If they're separate, Darak is still an S. Ravenoid's probably at the top of A. Just because if we're just looking at it from Drago's perspective, these two were cockroaches. You couldn't get rid of this guy, and he again nearly broke up the battle brawlers just with his meddling. Now, I could make this list crazy long, but I'm just gonna count these guys in one category. Well, except for the one that matters, the no nets. So, who are the no nets? They are the final group of antagonists in Bakugan Gen 1. Basically, the Genesis Dragonoid had a bunch of enemies, the No-Nets and Darachnoid, and when he had his big final battle with them, he banished them to the deepest parts of the Doom Dimension where their hatred basically was with them the entire time till they were finally able to eventually break out. Also, I'm not counting Cortigon in this, but focusing on the No-Nuts, Genesis Dragonoid is dead. He's been dead for centuries. So they have the next best thing, his descendant being our current Drago. And it's a okay backstory. And the No-Nuts do have distinguishable personalities, but you just don't really care about the No-Nuts till they're being killed off. And that doesn't really have anything to do with Drago specifically. That's just their camaraderie with each other. And again, only one of them really counts. I'm sorry, only one of them really like have a standing presence. Like, technically, they're really strong, and I guess it's supposed to be like that old generation's really powerful because, they fought the original Dragonoid, and even though after all that they can do so many things, that doesn't make any sense because when you take into consideration how powerful Drago's gotten, but it is what it is. The no nets are probably going to go in like C, but the only one who really matters in here is Betatron. He's the one who kind of got the most focus. He's the important one. He's the leader. And Betatron, again, he's not that great as a Pacific rival to Drago. It's just that he was the leader and he had everything taken from him because of his big fight with Cortigon, and then immediately, just so all of their deaths would mean something, he attempted to take his frustration out on Drago again, reiterating that this doesn't really have anything to do with Drago. But that battle with Drago in the Doom Dimension is pretty fire. But all that really does is probably put him out of D and probably maybe in the middle of C. We will try our best to end on a high note because there is some good and bad here, and that is Riptak. I am positive I said that name wrong. But what made it interesting here is, well, let's go over the backstory first. Riptak was introduced in Mactanium Surge Part 2, and in the first episode, we see that him and his partner Guz are basically in the final tournament ever. Like, this is the best of the best. The Martial Arts World Tournament, the Masters 8, yada yada yada, Battle City, right? And he defeats Marucho and whoever Marucho's current partner is at the time. And the reason for all this is that Guz and his partner Riptak lost to Dan and Drago somewhere in between part 1 and 2, and the loss was so humiliating they vowed to get as strong as possible so they'll never have to be humiliated like this ever again. And they did just that. They basically trained their butts off for so long, and then finally they reached Dan and Drago's level, in air quotes, and they are at least in the top 3 if we're supposed to take this as literal as they're expecting us to. And that is the problem, the overall problem. These two guys came out of nowhere, and we get a rushed backstory and we're just have to accept that they're on the brawlers level. Now, granted, the no nets do this too. Battle creep is a thing that happens in Bakugan, but it is just really, really forced for us to accept a lot of this stuff. Granted, I said this about Shun's current partner in this season as well. It's a good backstory. It's just a bit hard to believe in terms of the results. And it'd be nice to see some of this stuff. But Mactanium Surge is cut up into parts. They are rushing stuff. It is what it is. As a rival, Riptak, this is where we get to the good. Riptak has a very unique position because when Cortigon and his goons, his brothers, whatever, attacked, Guz went missing. So Riptak stayed with the Brawlers, and he had the privilege of basically being Drago's other partner with Dan. So they have a brother in arms type of relationship / rivalry. So when it's finally time for these two to fight each other at the very end of the season, it actually is kind of nice. Outside of the fact that they finally bring the Jing power back, it's actually kind of nice. These two have developed a deeper bond with each other outside of just two guys who really wanted to fight. So it's nice to see that. If this was a full-on season, it probably would have been even a little bit emotional, just from the perspective of Drago and Riptak. Not enough to get an S, obviously, because again, it'd be nice if things were a bit longer, but this season was dealt a bad hand amongst other things. But I do like that part in terms of a rivalry with Drago. In my soul, I don't think he's the ultimate rival for Drago. And I do think overall Riptak was a good idea in terms of Drago rivals on where they wanted to end off this version of the character. Because I'm positive, even though he lost to Dan and Drago again, he's not going to give up and he's going to keep trying to be better, because at the end of the day, that's really all what we can do. Before I close the video out, I'm going to take this moment to show you guys what the tier list looks like, and I will put the final spots for where everyone is. I am being a little lazy about it, but I have all of the Bakugan listed here, except for the no nets as a group, because I will be just editing a picture of them in later, because finding every individual member is going to take too long, and I want to get this over with. So, we'll just do this in order of what I listed them in the video. Again, making it easier for me to edit. So, Reaper, for now, I'll have him be. I don't remember where I said all of them were going to go, because I didn't do this recording in one session. For the sake of argument, I'll have Hydronoid. I'll have Hydronoid in S. I'll have Naga in A, and I'll have Helios in S. Rubinoid, again, I like the Bakugan. I like that it looks distinguishedly different, Ruby and everything. But as a rival, he probably goes here. He doesn't really have a relationship with Drago outside the fact that they just fought like a couple times and he beat Drago. Darak, as I said, so Darak and Ravenoid, if he is going in S, I think his story is just really good. Even though I know Gundam Invaders is where most people fell off, I will probably put him... Okay, this is what I'm probably going to do. I do still think Ravenoid's story, even if you want to separate them, Ravenoid's story is still pretty solid, not great. So I think I'll put him in D. I'll put Reaper... Reaper will be top of B for now, and I think I'll put Naga in A. And then we have these two. So the no-nets are probably going in C by proxy. I like Rubinoid better than all of them, but at least they have an actual story with Drago. It's not, the most interesting because they're all pretty boring, but Rubinoid on his own is just cooler than all of them. But if I'm being fair and take my bias out of it, that's just where that goes. And he isn't... Betadron is alright. He is just the most interesting member. I also think he's probably the lamest in terms of design, but I'm just going to have him here. Because Riptak actually got to spend time with Drago as a teammate, and who were basically former rivals who had to come together, he does have a leg up on the others. He doesn't have that personal beef with Drago the way... Well, he technically does, but it's not as personal as with Ravenoid. And I do just... Even though I'm not the biggest Reaper fan, despite all those things I said, I do think Reaper's cooler than him. But if I gotta be unbiased about this, and I really, really think about it. Okay. Revenoid is in B? No, sorry. Riptak is in B. If we got to see more of Guz in part 1 of Magnesium Surge, let's just say when we had to see Dan, beating up some randoms because they had to gas up, Dan and Drago, but also it was one of those moments where Dan and Drago couldn't control their powers and someone got wrecked. If that was Guz and Riptak, then I definitely think it would be a bit more interesting. But put all that aside. Okay. It depends on where I fall asleep and where I wake up, but he is in B. If you really, really stretch it, depending on how much you like the like, you know, brother in arms camaraderie between Drago and Riptak, he could be A. He easily could be A. But then I gotta think about it. Let me just do this. Let me just do this. If I go with my heart, I do think Reaper is cooler than the two of them in terms of design and whatnot, but if I want to put one of them down, I gotta really, really think about it. If one had to go down, it might be Helios. Not because Helios isn't good. It is because as a rival, Helios beat Drago. Well, okay, Helios fought Drago the most out of everyone on this list. Or at least Spectra and Dan fought. Well, yeah, they did fight the most if I think about it. But he couldn't match Drago in strength. But I do think his story and how he just, you know, end up considering Drago a genuine friend is really good. In comparison to these two, Hydronoid and Darak, those two were just like this crazy obstacle. And when Drago finally beat Darak, which is why I do think he's similar to Helios, Darak just went nuts for a bit. And I just really like that scene. But these two kind of serve the same purpose. And he's also similar enough to Helios that I think, you know, it's just a bit better. Also, he as weird as it is, does have that story connection. But overall, if I go with my heart, if I go with my heart and I'm biased, then it's like this. If I'm being fair, it would probably be this. I know I'm doing a lot of heavy lifting with Naga. No one's in F just because F doesn't really count. Isn't really here. Just ignore that. The lowest one is D. And this is probably where I'm gonna have it. And with that, we 100% have the video done. Thank you guys for watching. If you don't agree with this list, please let me know. What do you think? Who do you think is an S? Tell me how you would rank them down below in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe as well. And I'll catch you guys next time.